This is the story of Rantowles Creek. And like most stories about tidal creeks in the low country, this story begins in the mud. As you can see, the pluff mud runs deep along the banks of Rantowles Creek, a lot like the culture and history of the surrounding area. Creek water cuts through the pluff mud along the banks of the rice dikes dug by enslaved people hundreds of years ago. It meanders under Savannah Highway Bridge, just south of Red Top, South Carolina, and a rusty CSX railroad truss. From there, it flows into the Stono River, past Johns Island, James Island, Kiwi Island, and into the Atlantic Ocean. This mud could talk, probably tell some stories. Stories about dinosaurs that once roamed the area, only to mysteriously die off, then have their bones mined and crushed for fertilizer. And tell of the native peoples who hunted and cultivated the land, only to have it taken from them by greedy colonizers. And it tell of the enslaved people who built this area, who rose up against their overlords, slaughtered them, burned their plantation houses, and route to freedom. And it tell of the meager militia of the Continental Army that bravely fought and eventually defeated the mighty British Empire. Some people know these stories better than most. They've learned them from centuries of oral tradition in the South Carolina reading room at the Charleston County Library. But most importantly, they've experienced the stories by paddling these creeks, stepping in the pluff mud. They know that the stories will likely be lost with the pluff mud when it's paved in concrete.
People are drawn to the Low Country as a special natural place. It's I think Charleston is maybe certainly special and maybe unique on the whole eastern coast by virtue of having all of this relatively undeveloped land around it, and to have something this close is particularly special. And these waterways that we have in woods and marshes are of enormous recreational value to residents. Well, this is the sort of upper reaches of Rantowles Creek. Rantowles Creek is in essence a tributary of the Stono River, which is down this way. I've been coming here, I've been canoeing in the Low Country for probably approaching 35, 40 years, and coming here close to about that length of time. You paddle up there and you get out of view of this subdivision, Poplar Grove, and you really feel like you're in a remote place. And that's a rare thing this close to a city. We realize people are going to be moving to the area. They move to the area because it's so beautiful and there's so much natural amenities in great part. But if we keep destroying these places, it's going to look like every other place in America. We keep filling in the wetlands and tearing down the woods, and every time there's a new development, we don't try to live with the landscape that's there and the trees that are there. They just completely fill everything. They obliterate every living thing, raise the land up, push the flooding off somewhere else, to take the natural wetlands away, the natural buffers, the natural landscapes that absorb that runoff, and ruin the very character that makes this area special.
Let us begin with the Native Americans that were living here before the Europeans ever arrived. And what we had along our coastline were these small hunter-gatherer tribes that tended to collect in one area. And today what we have left of most of them is simply their names, like Siwi, Kiowa, Wampi, Santee. These were all small area tribes. And the area that we are in right now, this was the home of the Cusco Indians. So, who were the Cusco? They were typical of this region. They were a very small tribe. They lived in villages, and actually they would do their census by the bowmen, because what counted was how many hunters they had. And so the tribes will have the names of will have the number of bowmen, but that's pretty much all they will record. They may have had 2 or 3 children and wives that aren't counted, because bowmen were important. So here are the Cusco Indians. Well, the first boats arrive here in the year 1670, and in 1671 we're already a good 15 miles outside of Charleston, and the European settlers are here. They first say these Indians are very friendly, but within a year they decide, no, we're going to war with the Indians. And why? The reason that they decide that is because the Indians are assuming that all of these cattle that they're coming with and all of these crops belong to everybody. So the Europeans see it as stealing, that they're taking their grain and they're taking their cattle. And so they declare war on the Cusco Indians, and they're going to capture them all. Interestingly enough, the ones that did not pay a ransom are going to be shipped down to the Caribbean, so they're going to be enslaved in the Caribbean. The Europeans learned very early on they couldn't enslave Native Americans on this land because they knew the countryside and they would escape. So the ones that were not shipped down had to pay a ransom, and that ransom was in deer skins. And this is the beginning of what we have the trade going on between the Native Americans and the Europeans, is they're going to become more valuable for their ability to bring in deer skins, and we're going to get our slaves now from Africa. We're going to have enslaved Africans, and they essentially no longer going to enslave Indians after a few decades. So this is the second year that the Europeans here, and already we're having contact with these Cusco Indians. By 1703, not knowing any better, the Indians have sold the land to the Europeans, and they didn't understand at all what they were doing, and it was a huge piece of property. It was over 18 square miles. It went from the Middleton plantation on the Ashley all the way to the Edisto River. So they are selling the land, but they're still here. They have learned, however, they cannot turn around and take the grain and take the cattle, because they've already been put to war over that, and the ones that stayed paid the ransom, and they understand.
So my name is Sabrina Creel. My native name is Gray Wolf. I am a member of the Edisto Natchez Cusco tribe of South Carolina. We are now officially located out in Ridgeville, South Carolina. I am an active tribal council member. I sit on our tribal council board, and I'm an active secretary for our tribe. I do a lot of our PR work, trying to get our tribe well known. It's kind of sad that we're the tribe of Charleston technically, but nobody knows about us still. Our tribe was originally one of what they call in the textbooks there the first civilized tribes. The first 5 civilized tribes in the United States was the first tribes that the settlers that they actually met. We weren't violent. We actually welcomed them, and we took them amongst us and we kind of taught them how to live. Technically, the Kuso part of our tribe, because we're actually 2 tribes into one, technically the Kuso tribe was the tribe located here in Charleston. We were here pre-Columbus days. When they came and they met us, we traded. We taught them how to farm. We taught them how to garden. We taught them how to live here with us. And they kind of taught us their religion. They taught us about Jesus. They taught us about, guns and things that we didn't necessarily have here to make it a little bit easier than what the natives did. But as time went on, in the 1700s, when the French came over, there was a lot of French and Indian fights. Well, that caused some of what they called it's really pronounced Nochi, that caused the Nochi tribe from Mississippi to kind of break up in different bands. And one of those small bands decided to go towards North Carolina. They got to North Carolina, well, fights were still there, so they ended up coming on down a little further up there with the Cherokee up north of upper state South Carolina, and then they ended up here in Charleston. They ended up with us, and then we kind of banded it together. So then as settlers came and the more they took of the land in our area here, they kind of kept pushing our tribe kind of further down towards the Edisto River. They pushed us, and then finally, in between the 1800s there, the state of South Carolina kind of gave our tribe the area along the Edisto River where we're currently still at today. So originally we were out here in Charleston, but then they kind of pushed us out.
In 1700, so this is shortly after the first settlers arrived. They've arrived officially in 1670, but 1700 this land is going to be deeded to John Drayton, and this is those powerful Drayton families that are going to own property all over the Carolina Low Country. But John is going to sell this land off pretty quickly. He's going to sell it off in 1818, and it's going to be sold to the Bulow family. So we are now going to have the Bulows come in, and we're going to have the name of the plantation change from Savannah, which was the name Drayton had given it, and now it's called the Bulow Plantation. So that's where we are going to get that name. And what we want to think about in this time period is what is going on all around here. This is all rice country, and so the profit off of this land is actually the great rice fields. It's a very complicated process growing rice, and the enslaved that are brought here are actually brought from the rice fields of Africa because they're the ones that are knowledgeable in the cultivation of this crop. It is a tremendous laborious system. They come over to find these wetlands. They must cut down the timber with either axes or two-man saws. And after that, they are putting in dikes. They have to level the fields. And the thing that makes it so profitable is that 5 or 6 barrels of rice can be produced by one slave. That's how profitable it was. And when I say barrels of rice, we're not looking at boxes of Uncle Ben's. We're talking 500-pound barrels. So one enslaved person is producing that much wealth off of these plantations. And we do know in the census of 1850 that the current Bulow at that time that owned this plantation, he had over 20 slaves out here. He had a total of 144 enslaved people, but we know 24 of them were out here on this plantation involved in the cultivation of rice, and on the highland they are growing corn. So this is going to be maintained as a rice plantation. So this is a description in 1775 of what was involved in the work in a rice plantation. The reader must observe upon this account that the cultivation of it is dreadful, for if a work could be imagined particularly unwholesome and even fatal to health, it must be that of standing like the Negroes, ankle and mid-deep in water which floats in oozy mud, and exposed all the while to the burning sun, which makes the air they breathe hotter than human blood. These poor wretches are then in a furnace of stinking putrid effluvia. And that's a description written by a visitor in 1775 of what it was like on a rice plantation.
Near this sacred space here along Rantowles Creek and close to Wallace Creek is what we know in our lexicon of history as the Stono Rebellion of 1739. It was near this space here on September the 9th, 1739, that people of African descent began a transformation of history and culture, not only of the colony of South Carolina, but the United States moving forward. In fact, this was the first major slave revolt on North American soil, led by Africans that had been brought here in chains, dispersed through the harbor of Charleston, and then eventually taken to the western part of the county where we are now today. The Stono Rebellion, as it was known, was actually a brainchild of Africans seeking freedom with an understanding if they could make it to Spanish Florida, specifically to Castillo San Marcos, Fort Mose, or to St. Augustine, they could be free. As we all know historically, that the Spanish, in their continual conquest of North America, always find ways, I guess, to one-up the English. And so one of their edicts that they put out is that if any Africans could safely journey through Georgia, through northern Florida, and find themselves in St. Augustine, they would immediately become free. So without a tweet, without a post, without Facebook, Africans began to take this trek from the coastal area of South Carolina all the way down to St. Augustine, Florida. But on this fateful morning of September 9th, 1739, as these men had gathered together and on their quest heading towards St. Augustine, they encumbered upon other white owners, plantation owners, which saw what was going on and found a way to try to stop the situation. And as a result, the Stono Rebellion ensued, where Africans killed nearly 30 whites in this general community here. Nearly 50 Africans were killed as a part of this process here. But what it did is that it put on record and on notice that Africans wanted their freedom, and they were willing to do anything, short of anything, in order to attain that. So today, in 2021, we'll gather here near this sacred space to really ask the Low Country to protect, to preserve, to remember, and to commemorate this historic space that we've worked on and where we're standing now today. In my past life as an employee of the National Park Service, I was fortunate enough to work with the establishment of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, which stretches all the way from Wilmington, North Carolina, ironically down to St. Augustine, Florida. And over the last 21 years, I've seen tremendous transformation, change, and development to many of these historical coastal communities, waterways, inlands, and wetlands. And we're here today to say that there needs to be a pause in this movement. These places need to be protected, the history needs to be known, and it needs to be recognized. And so I and others have joined together in an effort to look at the Stono Rebellion site specifically along Rantowles Creek and along Wallace Creek to say enough is enough. And because of it, that's why we're standing here today urging others to join us in this quest of preserving and protecting these important fabrics in our American experience. In fact, the National Park Service in 1966 established the National Historic Preservation Act along with the United States Congress. And this National Historic Preservation Act puts a mechanism in place that recognizes and honors historic fabric places in our American experience. And we believe that this Stono Rebellion site deserves not only to be on the National Register, but not only to have a state historic marker that it has, but it also should be looked at as a National Historic Landmark because of its history and of its legacy. This place, this space allows us to talk about slavery. This place, this space allows us to talk about our American experience. This place, this space allows us to even talk about the miles that we have yet to travel as a nation.
Chile, Jordan, I want to cross over for see my Lord and get away, oh Jamie, get away, why on Jamie, get away, oh Jamie, we want to cross over for see we Lord. All of this area that they call the South Carolina Low Country is filled with our story, our legacy, his story, our journey. The blood, the sweat, and the tears of our Gullah Geechee ancestors literally was spilled on the soil and has made its way through the marsh into Rantowles Creek, into the Stono River. Our ancestors were the ones who beat those drums and said, join us in liberty, liberty, liberty. They've been a think free, but what were we? Are we going to sit by and let others today turn the area into a plantation? Are we going to protect the beauty of our environment, the ecology, the ecological balance, but more so than that, the culture that's kept this community in balance? It's kept a harmony, kept a spirit here. We ain't been to sing, oh, freedom, and a shout like this shot in the bush arbor for nothing. That cadence, that pace matches with those oars that were along that creek when Cato, Jemmy, and those that were part of the leadership of the Stono Rebellion took up arms to fight for freedom. They knew that there had to be a balance. There had to be a day where people recognized the humanity in one another, and that we all realized that Mother Earth, we were only put here to work with her, not pave her over.
All right, so now we're going to talk about what is commonly referred to as the Battle of Rantowles. But what we really need to know, it was not a major battle. Like most of the engagements that we have here during the American Revolution, and we're in the Revolutionary War now, it was actually a skirmish. It was a small group, and they meet each other, and they have a skirmish, and then everybody splits up. But the individual that's involved in this is well known. His name is Colonel William Washington. And what has happened is Colonel Washington first spies some of the British dragoons that are out, and he makes a quick attack on them. He kills 7, and he captures several, including their leader, who was a colonel, and had no injuries, nobody killed. 7 of the English are killed, and Colonel Washington with his cavalry runs off. But who is coming after them? It's going to be Tarleton. And Tarleton is known throughout our history as just one of these really cruel, kind of really ardent fighters. And this is going to be the first engagement between Tarleton and Colonel William Washington, because Tarleton is furious that his men have been captured, and so he comes after them. And this time he comes with his cavalry, his dragoons. So off goes Colonel William Washington with his kidnapped colonel and his other prisoners, And that's it. But this is known as the Battle of Rantolles. It's really more one of those many, many skirmishes that took place here during the Revolutionary War as the British are marching on their way into Charleston. They have yet to capture Charleston. They're marching on their way. This is how close they were at that time. Now we're going to talk about what happens to Bulow Plantation, because the rice is going to be over at the end of the Civil War. You don't have the great slave labor that is going to create it. And what's going to happen is this plantation is going to be sold off to a man named William Bradley. Now, why did he buy this plantation? He bought it because he knew it was in the phosphate beds. And what are these phosphate beds? There is a stretch of land, and it goes for about 75 miles along the coast from Charleston, South Carolina to Port Royal, and it's about 30 miles wide. So it's a layer of marl, M-A-R-L, and that is actually all old fossilized animals that were here back in the days when this was ocean. Well, people knew at the time that these rocks would appear in this area, and the farms used to take them out and just stack them in a pile to get rid of these rocks. But then somebody who was fossil hunting discovered that, well, heck, this is bone. This is valuable not just as a fossil, but this is actually a very, very important source of phosphate. It's over 50% phosphate, the bones of these animals that have created the marl. And so immediately, phosphate, fertilizer, it's going to be making the farm so productive, and all of a sudden we have this phosphate industry born here right at the end of the Civil War. So at that time, Bradley, who is a fertilizer baron, if you want to put it that way, he's up in Boston, Massachusetts, his headquarters. He has facilities in New Jersey, he has facilities in New York, he has facilities in Ohio, and all of this is part of his great empire of fertilizer. So now he's going to buy Bulow Plantation, and he's going to turn this into a washing station for fertilizer. It's kind of interesting. This is a carpetbagger. He's a northerner, and he never really does come down here to live. But they realize that they can't do good business if they don't have a local representative. So his local representative is going to be George Williams, who is more well known before times as a great blockade runner here during the Civil War. And the advertisement is going to be, the factor is George Williams, and the name of the company is the Carolina Fertilizer Company. So there's no inclination there to think this is one of those Yankees who actually owns the company and is making the money. He puts a huge investment here. The mining of this phosphate rock is all in the rivers. They had a monopoly from the government to mine phosphate in the rivers. So what they're doing is they're taking that rock out of the river, and then what they call wash it and grind it, and they're going to turn it into the fertilizer that is shipped all over. I mean, it's not just here. He's a massive, massive thing going here. A lot of the people that worked were the former enslaved people. The African Americans are now going to work there, but in addition, it's a really dirty work. You're down in the rivers, you're bringing up the rocks, and in addition to the African Americans, they're going to have a lot of the Irish immigrants. So we have Irishmen working here in the phosphate mining, and then the last group is convict labor. The state would rent out convict labor to work here in the phosphate mines. We are going to become so rich, the area that is the marl bed. The city of Charleston, this is an amazing, amazing statement. It was the phosphate, or better known as the fertilizer capital of the world in the 1880s, the fertilizer capital of the world. And it really helped our government, which was in derelict condition after the Civil War, because the government, in order to give them this commission in order to go out and dig up the rock, was getting $1 a ton. So almost half of the state budget was coming off taxes from this great phosphate industry. What's going to happen to it? Well, we are going to end phosphate mining here after the great earthquake of 1886. They did continue phosphate mining in other areas, But what happens is we're now going to get a governor in who doesn't like the monopoly, and he decides that he's going to put it up for bid. He sells it to different people, and then he gets lawsuits, and that ties it up. And by the time they finally settle the lawsuits and the whole thing has been set aside, it turns out that the phosphate industry is on a death knell here, because we are now getting phosphate from the beds in Florida. They're producing phosphate cheaper, and it's also being replaced by guano. So I love the name of the book that is the history of the phosphate industry. It's called Stinking Stones and Rocks of Gold. Initially, it was those stinky rocks that they were piling at the sides of their fields, and then when it turned out to be so valuable as fertilizer, it became a rock of gold rather than a stinking stone.
I distinctly remember the very first time I came out here, decades ago. We were sitting on a bank in the creek up there, and you know, I was new to canoeing and new to being out in natural areas at all, and we were sitting there having lunch, and an otter swam by, and then another otter, and 5 otters swam right below us, and that was a great thing to see. So otters are out here, minks probably, certainly lots of different birds. Your typical deer, raccoons, possums, things like that. Unlike many of these old rice areas in places like the Ace Basin Refuge and so forth that are still currently managed for waterfowl, these wetlands up here are not managed. They're not. The dikes are not maintained. It's just natural ebb and flow of salt water and into the marshes and out. And you know, everything I've heard about salt marshes is that they're one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. And then they're completely dependent on good quality, healthy, clean water. If you start filling it with pesticides and fertilizers and so forth, you're going to degrade that marsh pretty quickly. And that's what's going to happen when you put in a development and fill 200 acres of wetlands adjacent that drain into the creek like this.
This is why people move here. This is what we need to protect. And we are constantly at risk of overdeveloping areas like this and ruining what God created. And that comes at such a cost of increasing flooding, which obviously decreases our home values, ruins quality of life, brings additional traffic to roads. You know, we only have so much land to build infrastructure, and really puts us at risk of, you know, the next big storm, the next Hugo, which we have no doubt whatsoever is coming. And so it is just incredibly vital that a place like this can remain as natural as it looks right now. Wetlands like these are critical for maintaining our ecosystem. All sorts of plants and animals thrive here. It's their habitat, and we are driving them out with additional development, which will have certainly downstream effects that I'm no expert on. What I do know better is flooding. I live in Shadow Moss. It's one of the neighborhoods in this area that floods the most, and it's because of the irresponsible development further upstream that's altering the way that drainage is meant to work. Every time you have one of these developments, water's got to go somewhere. When that water isn't absorbed in a place like this that's meant to absorb it, it's going to find areas to run off into. It's going to overflow creeks. The development has historically happened along creeks, and so we get flooding that comes at a massive economic cost. My family can't be forced to bear the cost of flooding when these developers are making profits off our most valuable resource, which is the environment that we live in.
Well, in South Carolina, we have about 350,000 acres of coastal marshland, almost probably more than any other state on the East Coast. And they're really critically important for many different reasons. Number one, of course, in Charleston here and throughout the Low Country, we love seafood, and wetlands are a great nursery ground for a lot of the fish and shrimp and crabs and other things we love to eat and consume. Obviously, we love to recreate in the wetlands too, in terms of canoeing and kayaking and fishing, and they provide wonderful opportunities for recreation. But more importantly than that, they're great buffers. They're what we sort of call the resilient landscape. They're great buffers in terms of storm surges, in terms of being able to attenuate storm events and store floodwaters. They help in many different, they're going to be helping in terms of sea level rise, and buffering the effects of sea level rise. Culturally, these wetlands define the Low Country. It's called the Low Country for a reason, because the continental shelf rises through here. We have a dip in the Earth's mantle, and we have these great wetlands that come way inshore, much more than any other state along the East Coast. And so they've defined how this area was settled, they defined the economy, they defined the culture. So they define sort of all the rituals and traditions that make the Low Country what it is, right? And the more we begin filling in wetlands, altering wetlands, degrading wetlands, fragmenting wetlands, we begin losing that cultural identity, that reason we call the Low Country this place, and the identity of this place. And so it's really critically important, in order to preserve and protect and conserve the tidal wetlands that we have, we begin treating the land that drains into these a bit differently, and with a little bit more respect and a little bit more nuance in terms of trying to control the runoff that's coming into these wetlands and the buffers that surround these wetlands. These coastal wetlands are one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. And you see a lot of the grasses behind me, the Spartina alterniflora, the smooth cordgrass, and the black needle rush, and all that grass puts in a lot of biomass into the soil, which adds carbon, which creates nutrients for all the microorganisms there, which then start feeding the fiddler crabs and the smaller organisms, which all becomes part of the food web with the fish and the birds and the shrimp and the crabs and the oysters, and that's all one big food web. And all those nutrients actually drift out to sea too and begin feeding marine organisms. So without our wetlands here, most of our seafood industry around here would collapse. We wouldn't have the shrimping that we have here. We wouldn't have the oyster beds and oyster reefs that we have right now. And so they're critically important in terms of maintaining those ecosystems and that whole food web there.
This salt marsh habitat is almost unparalleled in this environment itself, in that without the salt marsh existing, lots of other ecosystems around here and habitats would cease to exist as well. So we've seen bald eagles, we've seen swallow-tailed kites, we just saw an osprey above us. I mean, you can hear woodpeckers calling out there today. We've seen great egrets foraging along these mud banks here. So you can see just in itself the amount of bird life that the salt marsh contains, and those are just the ones that we've seen. 5% of our land here in the USA is wetlands, and 5% is pretty low sounding to me. So if everybody is kind of wanting to live around 5% of our land, how long is that really going to last? How much longer will we be able to observe pristine, untouched habitats like this one before us? With those developments comes lots of factors that could definitely harm this ecosystem down the road. And not down the road as in 200 years, but down the road as in 20 years.
And you know, this place is rather overwhelming. It's incredible, and it's the ideal outdoor classroom. And I guess the value of it, it's not just the science and nature, but that's truly a unique experience for him to see people fishing crab and fishing shrimp. And I don't know, I guess there's a huge value in him having a chance to look at that happening instead of just thinking that food comes from the grocery store. And you know, I believe there's a great value, perhaps intangible, but it's a great value that comes with being able to witness such activities. You know, on many levels, I understand what's behind development, but just as important is the fact that it'll be a tragedy to lose such a pristine, unique place, and I don't know, prevent people like him from having a chance to enjoy it, to experience, and instead he'll just learn about it and then he won't have a chance to live it.
Well, you know, let's look at this from a personal experience where many folks, you know, went fishing, shrimping, crabbing, just diving into the water. Some folks may have been baptized. Some folks may have just want to have a leisure place to put their boat in. These were the physical places and spaces that were part of the coastal landscape of South Carolina now that are under tremendous threats. Boat landings, development, condominium homes, and everything else. And so I think in this conversation that we're having here today, it's so important that we take time to pause to know what was here first and what were people doing historically in these communities. And I think when we can take time to pause to look at the history, the culture, the legacy, and the heritage of our communities, it may make us look at how we are transforming the landscape. You know, the way our landscape is being transformed now in the 21st century, in some respects, as how it was in the 17th century when people of African descent were brought here and transformed the coastal landscapes from swamps and inland swamps into rice fields, which brought an economic opportunity for the colony of South Carolina, making it one of the richest colonies in the New World. Now in 2021, we are transforming the landscape again from an economic perspective, but is the economic perspective we're doing is, are we leaving, are we losing a history, a culture, a community, a viewshed, a landscape?
Looking at the question of what would we lose if we lose this site, number one, we lose visual history. And for example, people love coming to downtown Charleston because they see a house that was built in 1780 and it's still there. What we have lost here is the landscape of our history. This is the landscape of the remaking of an entire coastline by enslaved labor. I have heard the value of the labor to remake our whole coastline was more than the labor involved in making every one of the great pyramids in Egypt. So it's a tremendous statement of what the enslaved provided to the building of America. And the minute you start taking these great wetlands, these are not natural wetlands, these are all slave-based rice fields that you're looking at. That's why they're all level. And you lose that whole story when you start putting a big mansion right at the edge. When you fill in a creek, when you channelize it, you've lost the whole story that we have here of how this entire landscape was remade in the 17th century. Also, clearly, we do have elements left from the days of the phosphate industry. And I mean, how few people even realize that this was the great phosphate industry. And then it occurs to me, we're going to be destroying all these fossil beds, and we keep finding these wonderful fossils in our marl. And so we're going to lose all those fossil beds, but the big thing that you're going to lose is an environment that can be enjoyed while you are searching for the history that created it.
As being a Native American and from the tribe that was originally here, I think the best case scenario for this place was to leave her as she is. Mother Earth has left her this way. I think it would be great in the future that maybe some type of recognition in this spot that the Native American tribe that I'm from, the Natchez-Cusco tribe, lived here. It would be a place that is an honorary historical remembrance for our tribe and people that come here to learn. We could bring our children here. We can teach them our history here. We can go in the rivers that our ancestors once did. We can go and show them the way of life in this natural setting instead of being where we were placed. It would be ideal that in 500 years when I'm still not here, or your children are not here, that this place is still here because it was here before we got here. So it needs to stay here so that we can always keep and remind people of where we came from.
They can breathe in peace. They can breathe in freedom. See, even the birds agree with me. They're chirping to co-sign that now is the time for all of us to tell the whole story, the whole journey that all of us have taken to make South Carolina what it is, make the Low Country what it is, and rest of us make the Gullah Geechee Nation what it is, and things like that. And to know that no one deserved what took place in the crime against humanity, but everybody deserves their right to freedom, deserves their right to a quality of life. And what quality of life will we have if we destroy our environment? But many times we don't realize we're destroying sacred grounds of cultural areas. We don't realize the cultural legacy that's in every grain of sand in our Sea Island soil and throughout this area that they call the Low Country, because ecologically we're technically below water level. It's not because in any way we're low spiritually. Believe me, we still shouting right here along the creek and right there shouting underneath the tree. But we want you to journey with us. And after you know this story, see if it ain't something that you will shout about right wherever hunter to be. Because definitely it's time for all of us to gather together on this shore and shout some more about how we protected a historic place, a beautiful space, and that we keep the ecology of the Low Country so that we can continue to thrive and survive as a cultural community.
A reporter recently asked me, "From whom are you trying to rescue Rantowles Creek?" Not fully understanding the question, I asked him for further explanation. To which he responded, "In order to be successful in this campaign, we had to rescue Rantowles Creek from some kind of boogeyman. Developer, polluter, etc." To which I responded, "There's no boogeyman. We're merely trying to rescue Rantowles Creek from ourselves. Only we can stop the sprawl and overdevelopment in Charleston County by letting our local, state, and federal representatives know, Like Michael Allen said, this place, this space, allows us to talk about slavery. This place, this space, allows us to better understand the American experience. And this place, this space, reminds us how far we've come as a nation and how far we've yet to go. You see, after the Stono Rebellion, colonists from the Carolinas executed the insurrectionists and passed some of the most oppressive laws in our nation's history. These laws remained on the books for 200 years and prevented enslaved people from learning how to read, learning how to write, and gathering in large groups. They were an attempt to cover up our nation's worst atrocity by taking away the voice of the enslaved people. And the question remains whether we, 200 years later, intend to further participate in that cover-up by allowing this beautiful place to be paved in concrete. This place deserves to be protected for newcomers like myself, for the ancestors, the native people who once lived here, and the ancestors of the Gullah Geechee people who basically built this. So contact your representatives. Share this movie with them. Tell them that you want to protect the Pluff Mud and you want to rescue Rantowles Creek.